In 120 days, the blue helmets disappear. No more peacekeepers in Lebanon. No more food trucks in Sudan. No more nuclear inspectors in Iran. The United Nations, the most ambitious project in human history, has an expiration date, July 2026. And it's not because of a war, it's because the world's biggest landlord just stopped paying the rent. On January 30th, 2026, the Secretary General of the United Nations sent a letter to 193 countries that should have been front-page news everywhere. It wasn't. The letter said the UN has 4 months of money left before complete institutional collapse. Not budget shortfall. Not funding challenges. Collapse. The organisation that mediates conflicts, coordinates humanitarian aid, and maintains 11 peacekeeping missions with 60,000 troops deployed across war zones might close its doors in July because it's broke. Now, here's the part that should terrify you. The United Nations isn't broke because of corruption, or bureaucratic waste, or because Luxembourg forgot to pay its dues. It's broke because the United States, the country that pays 22% of the regular budget and hosts the UN headquarters, decided to stop paying. Not reduce funding, stop. $2.2 billion in unpaid regular budget dues. Another $1.8 billion for peacekeeping. That's $4 billion the UN expected to receive and didn't. The global institution designed to prevent World War III is running out of money because one man in Washington said, "No, I don't think I will." That's less than the price of 2 Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carriers. For the price of a rounding error in the Pentagon's budget, the US just turned off the lights for global diplomacy. The decision happened incrementally throughout 2025. Trump withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council in February, then UNESCO, then, by August, the administration announced it would boycott the Universal Periodic Review process entirely. Then the payments just stopped. The US paid nothing to the regular budget in 2025. Only 30% of the expected peacekeeping contributions. And in January 2026, the proposed budget slashed UN funding by 83%. You weren't aware of it because it happened in committee meetings and executive orders, while everyone was arguing about other things. Here's how the UN is supposed to work financially. 193 member countries pay assessed contributions based on GDP. The richer you are, the more you pay. America's 22% share, China's 20%, Japan's 6.9%. This isn't charity. These are legal obligations members agreed to. The regular budget funds the core UN operations, $3.45 billion for 2026. Peacekeeping is separate, $5.4 billion. The US pays 26.15% of that, although Congress capped it at 25% in 1994, apparently because even then America wanted a discount on global stability. The UN doesn't have reserves, it can't issue bonds, it can't raise taxes. If countries don't pay, programs stop. Unlike a government that can print money or a business that can take out loans, the UN's bank account is just the sum of what members send. When the biggest contributor stops sending checks, the math gets ugly fast. The institutional legitimacy of collective security. Once the UN closes peacekeeping missions because of funding, once humanitarian programs collapse mid-operation, once the precedent is set that the world's richest country can just opt out of international obligations with no consequences, you can't unring that bell. Countries don't forget who abandoned them. The idea that international cooperation is better than chaos. The functioning humanitarian programs that haven't yet shut down. The peacekeeping missions are still operational. The refugee services, the nuclear inspection regimes. All of it is still working. All of it is on borrowed time. That the UN was ever financially stable. That international law means anything without enforcement. That never again meant anything more than not on our dime. The UN worked because America paid for it to work. That arrangement just ended. This is not about Trump being mean to the UN. It is about the sudden revelation that the entire architecture of global governance since 1945 was built on one country's willingness to pay for it, and the second that country decided to stop, there was no plan B. The UN isn't collapsing because it failed. It's collapsing because it succeeded just enough to be indispensable and not enough to be self-sufficient. And once you see how fragile this system really is, you cannot unsee it. We're going to walk through exactly how this happened, why the numbers are so catastrophic, what cascades when the UN loses funding, how other countries are responding, why those responses won't work, and what fills the vacuum when the UN can't. This gets uncomfortable fast. The US didn't just reduce UN funding, it removed the financial foundation that the entire system was balanced on, and the numbers reveal something darker than budget cuts. Now let's start with the money, because everything starts with money, and in this case the money just stopped showing up. You might be thinking this is typical budget politics. Countries are slow to pay dues all the time, right? The UN probably has contingency funds, reserves, and some way to manage cash flow while waiting for checks. According to the UN's financial statements, the organisation ended 2025 with $1.568 billion in outstanding dues. That's more than double the amount outstanding at the end of 2024. Of that $1.568 billion, the United States accounts for approximately $1.429 billion in arrears, not including the 2026 assessment of $768 million. In other words, 91% of unpaid dues are from one country. Venezuela, the second worst offender, owes $38 million. This isn't slow payment, it's non-payment. The US paid $0 to the regular budget in 2025. Zero. Only 30% of the expected peacekeeping contributions. And the 2026 budget request to Congress asks for $263.8 million for all international organizations, an 83% cut from the previous $1.54 billion. The US isn't late on its bills, it's declaring it won't pay them. But wait, it gets worse. Because the UN has a rule that should be the punchline to a very dark joke. Imagine you're a non-profit that depends on donations to function. Your biggest donor, who provides 22% of your operating budget, stops donating entirely. But here's the twist. You have a bylaw that forces you to return any unspent money at the end of the fiscal year. So even though you never received the donation you budgeted for, you still have to give back the money you didn't spend from other sources. You're trapped in a Kafkaesque cycle of negative cash flow. That's not a metaphor. That's literally the UN situation. The UN is facing what Secretary General Guterres called a double blow. Unpaid contributions on one side, and on the other, an obligation to return funds they never received in the first place. The organisation is being asked to give back cash that doesn't exist. And unlike in 2025, when reserves could cover shortfalls temporarily, those reserves are now exhausted. The UN could run out of money by July 2026. But if you think this is just Trump being cheap, you're missing the real story. This isn't a budget cut. It's a controlled demolition. Here is the blueprint for how you kill a 193-nation alliance without firing a single shot. Now. You might think the UN saw this coming. You might think they prepared. Wrong. Because preparation requires believing the unthinkable is possible, and the unthinkable was that America would simply stop paying for the system it created. Trump didn't just cut funding, he systematically withdrew from UN bodies, creating a blueprint for dismantling international participation while maintaining plausible deniability. The money was just the first move. The real strategy was the exits. You might be thinking the funding cuts are about budget hawkishness, fiscal responsibility, America First economics. In February 2025, Trump withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council. In August, the administration boycotted the Universal Periodic Review, the UN's signature human rights accountability process. The US had participated in every review since 2008, including during Trump's first term. The administration withdrew from UNESCO, the cultural agency, initiated withdrawal from the WHO, which takes 1 year to complete, announced withdrawal from 31 UN entities in total, including climate treaties and gender equality bodies. Each withdrawal came with the same justification: waste, mismanagement, bias against US interests. This wasn't budget cutting, it was institution gutting. Because here's what's strategic about these particular withdrawals. The Human Rights Council allows countries to scrutinise each other's human rights records. UNESCO monitors cultural heritage and education. The AIIB coordinates global health responses. These aren't peripheral agencies. They're the ones that can hold powerful countries accountable. Withdrawing from them doesn't save money. It removes oversight. The US is still criticising human rights abuses in China, Russia and Iran, but it's refusing to participate in the forum where China, Russia and Iran could scrutinise the US. But wait, here is where the math gets insulting. Trump's team framed this as forcing other countries to pay their fair share, invoking the NATO playbook where he pressured members to increase defence spending. But here's the difference. NATO members can increase their military budgets voluntarily. UN contributions are assessed by formula, approved by the General Assembly. Trump can't unilaterally change what other countries pay. Only the General Assembly can, and that requires a majority consensus from 193 members. So when Trump says, "I'd get everybody to pay up just like NATO," he's describing a power he doesn't have to solve a problem he created. The boycott isn't about reform, it's about exit. By withdrawing from the accountability mechanisms first, then cutting funding, the US is constructing a permission structure for other countries to do the same. Russia and China are watching this very carefully. If the US can boycott human rights reviews with no consequence, why can't they? If the US can withhold billions in dues, why should they pay? So the US creates a funding crisis and a legitimacy crisis simultaneously. You might think the UN can just tighten its belt, cut some programs, wait for a new administration. Wrong. Because when you run the numbers on what the UN actually does with that money, the cuts become impossible choices. The missing $4 billion isn't accounting entries, it's peacekeepers in active war zones, food programs in famine regions, and refugee services for millions. When that money vanishes, people die, and it happens fast. Let's talk about the blood on the balance sheet. You might be thinking the UN is bloated. Too many bureaucrats, too many conferences, too much administrative overhead. Cut the fat, keep the essentials. Here's where the $3.45 billion regular budget goes. The largest portion of funds goes to the Secretariat, the people who coordinate international negotiations, document war crimes, monitor sanctions, and manage the global diplomatic apparatus. Another significant portion goes to the International Court of Justice, the primary judicial arm for settling disputes between nations. Economic and social programs, human rights monitoring, and peacekeeping support staff. This separate $5.4 billion peacekeeping budget funds 11 active missions with over 60,000 personnel deployed. Lebanon, where 10,000 peacekeepers maintain a buffer zone between Israel and Hezbollah. Mali, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where UN forces are often the only thing standing between armed militias and civilian populations. Cyprus, where peacekeepers have maintained a ceasefire line since 1974. The UN isn't bloated, it's stripped to basics already. In October 2025, facing budget shortfalls, Guterres ordered all peacekeeping missions to cut expenditures by 15%. and repatriate 25% of uniformed personnel. That means pulling 15,000 peacekeepers out of active conflict zones. Not because the conflicts ended, because the checks stopped clearing. The UN is literally choosing which wars to stop monitoring because it can't afford to monitor all of them. And then there's the humanitarian collapse that doesn't wait for budget negotiations. Imagine being a trauma surgeon and halfway through a surgery, someone tells you the hospital is out of funding, so you need to finish with 15% fewer surgical instruments and 25% fewer nurses. That's what's happening to UN operations. UNRWA, the agency providing food, education and healthcare to 5.9 million Palestinian refugees, was defunded entirely by the US in January 2025. WHO, coordinating responses to disease outbreaks across 194 countries, is in the middle of withdrawing US participation. UNHCR, managing refugee crises from Ukraine to Sudan to Myanmar, operates on voluntary contributions that just plummeted. When peacekeepers withdraw, violence fills the vacuum. When food programs shut down, famine accelerates. When refugee services collapse, migration crises intensify. The cost of UN operations sounds huge until you compare it to the cost of not having them. One day of the Iraq War cost more than the UN's entire annual budget. The humanitarian fallout from a single failed state costs more to address than preventing the failure would have. So you've got ongoing operations hemorrhaging, funding, and peacekeepers pulling out of conflict zones. You might think other wealthy countries would step up to fill the gap. You might think Europe, Canada, and Japan would recognize the existential threat and write bigger checks. Congratulations, you've just played yourself. Other wealthy democracies are too economically strained, politically divided, and increasingly hostile to US-led institutions to compensate for American withdrawal, and some are actively cheering the collapse. Welcome to the part where you realise the cavalry isn't coming. You think Europe will step up. Germany, France, and the UK. They're wealthy. They believe in multilateralism. Surely they'll increase their UN contributions to keep the system afloat. Let's look at the numbers. China pays 20% of the UN budget, about $690 million annually. Japan pays 6.9%, roughly $238 million. Germany pays 6.1%, about $210 million. France pays 4.3%, around $148 million. To replace America's 22% contribution, you'd need China to double its share, and every other major economy to increase theirs by 50% or more. That's not a budget adjustment, that's a political impossibility. Europe is not in a position to save the UN because Europe is in the middle of its own fiscal crisis. Germany's economy contracted in 2025. France is dealing with domestic political chaos and pension reform backlash. The UK is still managing post-Brexit economic adjustment, and every single one of these countries is facing massive defence spending increases because of Trump's NATO ultimatum to raise military budgets to 5% of GDP. They're being asked to simultaneously increase military spending by hundreds of billions and compensate for the US withdrawal from international institutions. The math doesn't math. And then there's the fact that many of these countries are actively boycotting American products in retaliation for Trump's policies. According to polling from early 2025, 70% of Swedes have considered or participated in boycotting US goods. Denmark reports 50% of consumers deliberately avoiding American products. Canada's border crossings to the US dropped 23% in February 2025. European tourism to the United States is down across the board. There are Facebook groups with 100,000 members dedicated to boycotting American goods. This is economically symbolic, but politically significant. The countries Trump is demanding pay their fair share are populations actively expressing hostility to American leadership. The political environment for increasing UN contributions is toxic. Governments that increase UN funding to compensate for American withdrawal look like they're rewarding American bad faith. They're politically vulnerable to domestic criticism that they're subsidizing US abandonment of commitments. So even if they had the money, which they don't, they lack the political will. The UN isn't getting rescued by allies. The allies are watching it sink and calculating how to protect their interests in the aftermath. So the UN is financially collapsing, allied countries won't or can't fill the funding gap, and peacekeeping missions are shutting down. You might think this is a temporary crisis that will resolve when a new administration takes office in 2029. Wrong. Because by then, other countries will have learned they don't need the UN if it can be defunded on a whim, and they'll have built alternative systems that exclude American influence entirely. China and Russia are not passively watching the UN collapse. They're actively positioning to fill the institutional vacuum with alternatives that advance authoritarian governance models and exclude Western human rights frameworks. Now here is where the villain wins. You might be thinking that if the UN collapses, nobody benefits. Global chaos is bad for everyone, including China and Russia. Let's look at what's actually happening. China has increased its assessed UN contributions on time, every time, unlike the US. China now provides more peacekeepers to UN missions than any of the 5 permanent Security Council members, except for the US historically. China's Belt and Road Initiative has extended to 152 countries, with over $1 trillion in infrastructure investment, creating financial dependencies that operate entirely outside Western institutions. Russia, meanwhile, has been expanding its influence in Africa and the Middle East through military contracts and energy deals, filling voids where Western engagement retreated. The UN's collapse isn't a problem for autocracies, it's an opportunity. Because the UN, for all its flaws, was built on Western liberal principles: human rights, rule of law, democratic accountability. When that system loses credibility because its primary sponsor abandoned it, authoritarian governments can offer an alternative model. Look, they say, the West promises democracy and abandons you when it's expensive. We promise infrastructure and deliver. We don't lecture you about human rights, we do business. But wait, it gets worse. Because China isn't just filling the vacuum the UN left, it's building parallel institutions that compete with the UN. Think of the UN as the World Bank and IMF of diplomatic infrastructure, the established system everyone begrudgingly participates in. China is building the alternative. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, competes with the World Bank. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization competes with NATO. The Belt and Road Initiative competes with Western development aid. These aren't temporary workarounds, they're permanent alternative architectures. And unlike the UN, which requires consensus and transparency, these institutions can move fast and deliver results without Western oversight. When the UN loses capacity, countries don't wait for it to recover. They take deals from whoever shows up with funding, and increasingly that's China. When African nations need infrastructure investment, China delivers. When Middle Eastern countries need diplomatic support without human rights conditions, Russia provides it. The US is discovering that you can't abandon international leadership and expect to reclaim it later. Someone else moves in, and they're not going to leave just because America decides it wants back in. So America defunds the UN, allies can't or won't compensate, and autocracies are building alternative systems that exclude Western values. You might think this is still reversible, that the next election cycle could restore funding and the UN could rebuild. Wrong. Because institutional collapse happens fast, and institutional reconstruction takes decades, and you don't get to rebuild with the same influence you abandoned. The Trump boycott isn't just damaging the UN financially, it's establishing a precedent that treaty obligations are optional, international law is unenforceable, and powerful countries can exit commitments without consequence, which destroys the foundation of all international cooperation. Let's talk about what happens when the rules turn out to be suggestions. You might be thinking this is about one institution. The UN is struggling, but other international agreements will hold. Climate treaties, trade deals, security pacts. The US isn't just boycotting the UN, it withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. Again, it exited the WHO in the middle of an organisation facing global health coordination challenges. It boycotted the G20 summit in South Africa, citing disagreement with the host country's domestic policies. Each withdrawal follows the same pattern: announce exit, cite grievances, withhold funding, move on. And critically, there have been no meaningful consequences. No sanctions, no isolation, no enforcement mechanism. International law only works if powerful countries voluntarily comply or face cost for non-compliance. The Trump administration is demonstrating that powerful countries don't face costs. The UN can't sanction the US. The World Trade Organization can't enforce rulings against it. The International Criminal Court can't prosecute its officials. Every international agreement America signs includes an implicit asterisk, binding unless we decide it's not. And if America can do it, why can't Russia ignore chemical weapons treaties? Why can't China ignore maritime law in the South China Sea? Why can't anyone ignore anything? And then there's the legal argument the Trump administration is using, which is more dangerous than the boycotts themselves. Imagine you're part of a homeowners association. Everyone agreed to pay annual dues that fund neighbourhood security, maintenance, and shared amenities. One homeowner, the wealthiest one with the biggest house, stops paying dues and argues that the HOA is inefficient and biased. When other homeowners complain, the wealthy homeowner says, "I'm not bound by rules I disagree with. Also, I'm keeping the security cameras I paid for last year." That's the US position. The Trump administration argues the UN is wasteful and biased against American interests. It's not bound by funding commitments. But the US still benefits from UN infrastructure, still uses UN diplomatic facilities, and still expects the UN to function for American interests. This establishes a precedent where international obligations are a menu, not a contract. You take what you want, decline what you don't, and face no consequences because no enforcement mechanism exists. This doesn't just damage the UN, it damages every treaty, every agreement, every multilateral commitment. Why should any country honour climate commitments if America exits when convenient? Why should any nation comply with nuclear non-proliferation treaties if enforcement is optional? The precedent being set is that international law is performative. Let that sink in. So we've established the UN is collapsing financially, allies won't help, autocracies are building alternatives, and the precedent being set demolishes the concept of international obligation. You might think the solution is replacing Trump, that a new administration restores funding and everything goes back to normal. Congratulations, you've just played yourself one last time. Even if a future administration fully restores UN funding, the institutional damage, lost trust, operational gaps, and geopolitical realignments created by the Trump boycott cannot be reversed, and the window for reversal is closing fast. Welcome to the part where we talk about what you don't get back. You think this is like Trump's first term. 4 years of chaos, then a new administration restores normalcy. Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement, rejoined the WHO, and restored relationships. We can do it again. Let's look at what actually happened during that restoration period. Biden rejoined the WHO in January 2021 after Trump's withdrawal, but during the gap, China increased its influence in the organization substantially, securing key leadership positions and shaping public health policy frameworks. The US rejoined the Paris Agreement, but the damage to American credibility on climate meant developing nations demanded upfront funding commitments before trusting US promises. It took years to rebuild relationships, and many were never fully restored. Now apply that to the current situation, but worse. The UN will have been operating in crisis mode for years by the time a new administration could take office in January 2029. Peacekeeping missions that shut down don't just restart. You need new Security Council resolutions, new troop commitments from member states, and new operational funding. Humanitarian programs that collapse lose institutional knowledge, personnel, and local partnerships. Those don't regenerate spontaneously. But here's the part that makes restoration impossible. The UN's institutional capacity is collapsing right now. By July 2026, the organization may be functionally insolvent. That means programs shut down, staff get laid off, contracts with member states for peacekeeping contributions get terminated. You can't just restart a peacekeeping mission in South Sudan when you've already sent the troops home and closed the base. You can't restart a famine early warning system when you've lost the monitoring infrastructure and trained personnel. And then there's the trust problem, which is much harder to quantify but far more destructive. Imagine you're in a relationship where your partner occasionally decides they're not going to pay rent, not going to show up for commitments, not going to contribute to shared responsibilities. And their justification is, I don't think this relationship is fair to me. When they come back later and promise to be reliable, do you trust them? Or do you start making backup plans assuming they'll leave again? That's the calculus every UN member state is making right now. Even if America fully restores funding in 2029, what stops the next administration from cutting it again in 2033? Why should countries structure their security around UN peacekeeping if those missions can be defunded midstream based on American domestic politics? The rational response is to build redundancy, create alternative security arrangements, and reduce dependence on institutions that America can destabilize. This is why the damage is permanent. It's not just about restoring funding, it's about countries learning they can't rely on the US to uphold commitments, and once that lesson is learned, behavior changes. Europe accelerates its own defense capabilities independent of NATO. Asian countries deepen security relationships with China. Middle Eastern nations hedge with Russia. The global architecture becomes multipolar by necessity, because the unipolar model just demonstrated it can collapse whenever American voters elect someone who doesn't want to pay for it. The UN on life support isn't a temporary crisis waiting for the next election cycle. It's the end of the post-1945 assumption that international cooperation is America's responsibility, and whether you think that's liberation or catastrophe depends on what you think happens when the most powerful country decides the world is someone else's problem. So let's recap what you've lost while you weren't paying attention. First, you lost the assumption that international institutions are financially stable. The UN was always one checkbook away from collapse, and now the checks stopped coming. Second, you lost the belief that allies would compensate for American withdrawal. Europe is too broke, too divided, and too resentful to save the system America is abandoning. Third, you lost the monopoly on institutional power. China and Russia aren't filling the UN-shaped hole. They're building parallel systems that exclude Western values and deliver faster results. Fourth, you lost the precedent that international obligations are binding. If America can boycott treaties without consequence, so can everyone else. And finally, you lost the ability to reverse this. Even if funding is restored in 2029, the institutional damage, trust destruction, and geopolitical realignment can't be undone. Countries learn lessons about American reliability, and they adjust accordingly. The UN isn't dying because it failed. It's dying because it succeeded just enough to matter and not enough to survive when its primary patron decided to leave. This was never about UN inefficiency or wasteful spending. It was about the moment the world realised the post-World War II order was a subscription service, not a social contract, and America just cancelled the subscription. The UN on life support is really just the international community discovering in real time that never again meant never again unless it's expensive, politically inconvenient, or championed by the other party. The architecture of global cooperation wasn't built on bedrock. It was balanced on America's willingness to pay, and that willingness just expired. So what fills the vacuum when the UN collapses? Regional power blocks, bilateral security arrangements that exclude universal human rights frameworks, Chinese infrastructure loans with no conditions except political loyalty, Russian military contracts, a world where might makes right because the institution designed to arbitrate disputes is broke. You might think that the world is more honest, more realistic, stripped of idealistic pretensions about global cooperation. Maybe it is. But it is also a world where the next genocide doesn't get peacekeepers because there's no institution coordinating deployments, where the next pandemic spreads faster because there's no global health infrastructure coordinating responses, where refugee crises metastasize because there's no international system managing humanitarian aid. The UN was always imperfect, bureaucratic, slow, compromised by geopolitics, but it existed. And existence matters when the alternative is nothing. The Trump boycott didn't just defund the UN, it revealed that the entire project of international cooperation was always optional. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. If this made you realise something about global institutions you hadn't considered before, hit the like button. It helps the algorithm understand that people care about international cooperation, even when it's collapsing. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into how systems that seem permanent turn out to be fragile. Because that's kind of the theme of the 21st century. And here's the question I want you to consider in the comments. If the UN collapses, what replaces it? Do we get a multipolar world with regional powers, Chinese hegemony, American isolationism with chaos everywhere else? Or does something new emerge that works better than the post-1945 system? I'm genuinely curious what you think because nobody actually knows the answer. I'll be reading your responses. This matters too much not to engage with. Thanks for watching. See you next time.